include some kind of behavior related with server, in connection with server. So we discussed 3 tag helpers so far: the hyperlink tag helper, the image tag helper, and then the environment tag helper. Okay. Now let's include the navigation menu in the application, right? So that and we'll try to include in such a manner that whether it is say it displays properly even if the device is not or the say device size is smaller, whether it is rendered on the desktop screen or a tablet or the mobile phone. And actually for that we don't need to do anything, right? Bootstrap helps us. Right. So we want to have this kind of navigation menu with the option of a list, with the option of create. Right? You want to display the list of stuff, you want to create a new stuff, you want this kind of image, right? And if it is opened on a smaller screen, right, then this is how when you click on the navigation menu, it will show the image and the list and create option and such things, right? So here we are including the classes for the navigation, right? You can see here. And in which file we are including them? In layout file. Right, because it is applicable to all the views, right? So it is better to include them in the layout file _layout.cshtml. So here is the navbar class. Okay, so the only thing that I've done is I've copied the code from the Bootstrap website and made some changes, right? You all know how to use Bootstrap. Okay. Yes. This is also in layout file. Okay. Okay. So then I'm including the image. Okay. And then I'm specifying. You can see that this is not a simple hyperlink control. It's the hyperlink tag helper. Because you will see this ASP controller, ASP action. Then what if someone clicks on the image? User should be redirected to the home controller's index action method. Okay, and then we have a toggle button in the navbar. Okay, and then we have the items like home or index. Again, those are the link actually list and create, right? And they are again the tag helpers because when the user clicks on the list, user will be redirected to the home index. When create, home create. The create we have not created so far, so we will do that. Okay. This render body will render the specific view of that action method. Okay. So now let's start with the most important tag helper, which is the form tag helper. Right? Whichever application you take, most of the time, at least you will have at least one view in which you need a form. Right. So in the form, we use the form tag helper. We use the label tag helper, we use the input tag helper, we use the select tag helper, we use the text area tag helper, we use the validation tag helper. So these many tag helpers we use when we design form. And if something is not available as a tag helper, then you can always fall back to HTML helper. Okay, except say a few tens of components, right? Most of the components that we use in daily life, right? They are available now as a tag helper, but still if something is not available, then fall back to HTML helper. So HTML helper will start with @HTML. Okay. We will see that if possible, then we will have on this coming Monday, we'll have a lab on this tag helper and HTML helper, right? Because that will be very much helpful to you when you will create a project. So here we have this form tag helper. So form tag helper means normally usually we have the form element, and there what we have action and method, right? Sometimes optionally we include ENC type and other attributes. So here the form tag helper will have ASP controller, ASP action, and the method. But ASP controller and ASP action is optional. Why? Because by default, when the form is submitted, that it is sent to the same action of the controller that has rendered the form. Because for rendering a form, there will be an action, right? So because rendering a form is rendering a view, and that is happening based on some action method. So if you don't specify the controller name in the action method name, then to the same method, it will be sent. It will send the response to the same method. What if you don't specify controller name, but you specify the action name, ASP action? Here, you include this ASP action, but you don't include ASP controller. Say the original form rendering is happening by home index. And now when you are submitting the form, so you are not specifying controller, you are specifying ASP action, create. Then it will send the response or send the request to the home create. But if you don't want to make a request to home create, from home index, you want to make a request to say student create or staff create. Then ASP controller staff, ASP action create. Okay, but just to avoid any confusion, it is conventionally suggested that always use ASP controller, ASP action. Okay, even if you are say falling back to the same action method or any action method within the same controller, still always use both attribute ASP controller, ASP action. Okay. Now input tag helper. Right. So let's directly see the code. So now we are changing the model somewhat. ID, name, email, and the department is as an enum. Okay. The reason is that I want to demonstrate the validation later on the enum properties. That's why this department is considered as an enum. And as a technical design also, it is more robust, right? So that's a change we have made in our model. And in the model itself, you can see here, right? In the models folder itself, we have this department or enum department. Okay? Or you can have in the same file as well, no problem. In the staff class itself, you can have it. And then based on that, we are making some changes in the mock staff repository, because now the value for department would change. Earlier it was string, right? Now it is an enum property. Okay, and now we are trying to create the create action method. We'll write the code for create action method. Okay, so here we are writing simply return view. So it is available in the home controller. Okay, and don't worry about this return type, whether it is a view result, action result. View result means it is rendering a view. So which view it will render by default? We are not specifying anything. Create.cshtml. Okay. So that's why. So after what I'm doing is I'm simply right clicking on this create. You can do the same thing from the project structure. So I'm right clicking on this action method create and selecting add view. And here I'm writing the create view. So this create view is for which model? Staff. I don't need to specify the namespace where it is available because I've specified in view import. Okay, that it is available in my project name dot models folder @ using, and I specified where that, right? That's why I'm only specifying @ model staff. Okay, then so here we are using a form tag helper, form ASP controller, ASP action, method post. That means this form must be sent to the create action method of home controller as a post data. Okay, then we have a label. So it is a label for name. Why ASP for name? That means it is related with the name property of staff model. Here these name NAME and these name NAME are same, and they must be same. That's how there is a resemblance. Okay, so you are linking the element with the model. So ASP for name, input for name. So there you know that, okay, it is a string, right? So it will create a input or input text box. What if you want to go for password? It would be input ASP4 and say here you may have some property, public string password. Then by just seeing a name password, it will not create a password box or a password text box. You need to decorate with using data annotations. So that we will see. Okay, you need to set that, okay, it is for password. Then automatically ASP4 will create for password. Then here input ASP4 email for the email. And here it is for our NM department. So here you will see these ASP items, because we use ASP items when we have drop-down list box. So here you can see that instead of input, I am using select, because for department multiple options are there. So I want to use drop-down list box. Okay, and here I want to take the value directly from the model. Right, in the lab we see that how we can pass it from the action method as well, when we don't have those things available in the model itself. Right. So here select ASP4 department, and where those values are available. Those values are available as a NM right in the department. So you can use this method get NM select list, for which NM DEPT. So it will populate the drop-down list box with all enum values. Okay, and why here we are writing HTML? Because this method is part of HTML helper class. It is not part of tag helper. Okay, that's why earlier I mentioned that HTML helper is still powerful than tag helpers. So we will use tag helpers, but whenever something is not available part of tag helpers, we'll use facility from HTML helpers. And you can embed HTML helpers within the tag helper. No problem with that. Okay. So we are using a method of HTML helper class. Okay, and then the button for create. Okay. I think both slides are same. Yes, they are same. Right. So then this is how this page will be rendered. And who will render it? When the URL is home create. Right. Then this action method of home controller will render this page. Right, with name, email, and the department select or drop down list. Okay, now when we click on create, what will happen? Anyone? Now say suppose I specify the name, specify the email, select the department, and if I click on create, then what will happen? Any idea? It will go to the create action method. And to which create action method it will go? See the form tag helper. The create action method that deals with post data. Okay. While this create action method deals with which request? HTTP request? We have not mentioned. That means get. By default, get. Okay. So by default, always it is get. Right. So, but here, when you click on this create, you are making a create action method of a home that handles post. Right. But we don't have such method right now. Right. Right now, we have only one method for create. So here, when you will actually click on create, okay. Okay, I think that discussions we have very later on. Fine. So now let's finish it verbally at least. We have this slide later on. So when you will click on create, you will have error because that action method doesn't exist, which can handle create with post data. So you need to create it. Okay, so right now if you will click on it, you will have error. Okay, but before that, we will discuss model binding. That how, by specifying these ASP4, ASP items, the input selected by user or the input provided by client will map with our model data. Okay. And then those values are passed to the corresponding action method in the controller. Okay. So that is model binding. So let's see how that happens. Sorry. So the model binding, earlier, I think in the yesterday's lecture, I was talking about parameter binding and model binding. but normally we don't use the word parameter binding. We use the word model binding. Okay? Even if you don't have model, right? It is a practice that instead of saying parameter binding, you say simply model binding. Okay. So model binding maps data in an HTTP request to a controller action method parameter. You can see this in this line where we are defining what is model binding. We are not including the model, right? So it's a loose definition, right? But intuitively, right, we keeps it. So model binding maps the data in an HTTP request. Whatever data is available in your URL, in the query string, or as a body of your form data, that will be mapped to the parameter of action method, right? And that is known as model binding. Whether you have a model, you don't have a model, doesn't matter. Okay? So the action parameters may be simple types like integers, strings, or it may be complex types like staff, customer, etc. So model binding is great because without it, we need to write a lot of code, right? So we don't need to write lots of code, and we actually get many other advantages of it. Okay. So here we have an example, simple. So we have a details action method, which is details one actually, 2 parameter, integer. Is it optional or nullable integer? Nullable integer. This is not optional. Okay, it is nullable ID or nullable integer ID and string name. Why string we are not making nullable? Yes, it is reference type. So by default, it is nullable. Right? String is a reference type. You can assign name is equal to null. For integer, you cannot assign it. Right? That's why, say for integral types like integer, double, decimal, you need to make them nullable. Right? While strings and such things are by default nullable. Okay. So now, say if my URL for details one action method includes only one parameter 1, right? So these parameter will be treated for ID. Okay. If I include one parameter 1 in the URL request, and then as a query string I include name, then the 1 is assigned to the ID, and the DDU is assigned as a name to the second parameter. You can see here. Let me just reduce the resolution. Yes. Now can you relate this? ID is the first parameter. Okay. And if you remember, then in the routing template also we mentioned that ID is a parameter in the routing template. Okay. Optional parameter in the routing template. That's why this one value will be directly mapped with ID. Okay. And here you are not specifying name. So we don't have any problem. That is not assigned to this parameter name in the action method. So there is no value displayed. While here, right, the name query string has a value DDU, so it gets displayed. Even if you then let's go. Yes, we have that example here. So now you can see in the form data, sorry, in the URL data, I'm specifying 1 after the details 1. Then the query string, I'm specifying the name with a funny, say, way of writing it, mixing scope. And then ID is also specified in the query string. Again, then which value it is taking? The value from the URL data. It is not taking from the query string. Right? And the name it is taking from the query string. Okay. So why? Because the URL data has a precedence, right, or higher priority than the query string. That's why. So as it is already available in the URL data, right, that's why it is taking from there itself. Okay. Then here, so I'm not including in the URL data. I'm including name and ID both in the query string. And see the order is different. In the action method, it is first ID, then name. But here it is name, then ID. So it doesn't matter. Then it will take the value from query string for both ID and name. So to bind the request data to the controller action method parameters, model binding looks for data in the HTTP request in the following places in the order specified. it will first look for form values. Okay, form value means the body of your data. First, it will look in the body of your data. If there it is not available, then it will check into the root values, URL. And there, if it is not available, it will look for query string. Okay, so first it will look into the form values. Okay, then form means body of your data. Okay, then route values, and then query string. And that's why here, so when it was available in the route values, that's why it ignored the query string. As it is already available in the URL itself, this route itself, that's why it is ignoring this query string. Okay, so HTTP request data, first it will check in the form value, okay, then the route values, and then the query string. Now we'll discuss that create action method, because now here when you click on the create, the binding for primitive type will not happen, the binding for complex type will happen, because here you are not passing this name, email, department as a separate, it's a string, right? Primitive data, you are sending them as a one, say one customer object or a staff object, in this case one staff object, so it is a complex type. Okay, so far we have this create action method, and now we are adding one more create action method, you can see here, which will take staff as an argument, right? Why? For model binding. So whenever some user will fill the form and click on the create button, then that staff instance will be available here because of model binding. Okay, and then here the return type of this method is redirect to action result, because here we are redirecting the user to a different action method. Okay, so what are we doing? So we are calling the add method in the repository, and we are asking it to add the instance in the list. Right now it is showing this red squiggly line because in the interface we have not created this method and we have not implemented it. We will do that. Okay, that's why the red squiggly line. And then once this new staff is added, what are we doing? We are redirecting the user on the details action method of a home controller, and in the parameter we are passing this ID. That means for this newly created staff, display the details. Earlier the URL was /home/create. User will fill the form, user will click on the create button. Then what will happen? The URL will change to home/details/5. For example, the newly created employee or staff has an ID 5. Right? So from this, user will request for this get action method, and then the user will, on successful creation, user will see the details action method's result for the new staff. Okay. Now let's add the signature or the, say, abstract add method into our interface, staff add staff. Right? It will take the staff object as an argument and it will return it. And then we need to implement as well. So here we are implementing it. Okay. And what are we doing? We are trying to identify the maximum employee ID from the list. So right now it would be 3. So we'll just add 1 to it. So the staff ID would be 4. Okay. Later on, when we'll deal with actual database and tables, we don't need to do this because we'll have our own logic, either auto increment or some other things. We'll seed it, so we don't need to handle it over the business logic. And then we are adding this staff object into the staff list temporarily. Okay, it won't be persisted. Right, these will happen only in the current request. In the next request, that object won't be available. And then we are returning the staff. So now here, so when I'm making home create, it is throwing this exception. I'm requesting the form for creating the staff object, okay, but it is throwing this exception. What could be the reason? The user is just trying to render the page which will allow user to create staff by specifying the name, email, and selecting the staff. But instead of rendering that form, right, it is throwing this exception. Yes, the reason is that there are two action methods. Here, in the home controller, there are two action methods with the create name. And there is no mention that when there is a GET request, which action method to use, when there is a post, which action method to use. Here, it's not like, say, whichever action method comes first, it will be rendered using GET, right? So that's not the case. And that's why this error, that there is a conflict. There are more than one action methods are available, right? And that's why it is throwing this exception, that multiple endpoints are existing in the system. So how to avoid it? Use by specifying the HTTP verb. So here we decorate this create action method with HTTP GET, and this create action method with HTTP post. Okay, so we say that, okay, when user is making a request for GET, render this or execute this action method. When the request is for post, then render this one. The other way is that both method can have a different name, right? Then in the form itself, in the ASP action, you can specify the action method name is different. But why to create a different name, right? And then also, then you will save yourself from specifying this HTTP GET. But here you need to specify this HTTP post. Why? Because the data is coming from post. Here this staff object is not going to come from the body of your form, sorry, the body of your request. It is going to come from the body of your form as a post data. So this HTTP verb you must specify, right? And that's why we usually keep the same name. So whether it is a create, these things will come in create. It will also come with edit. When you are editing the record, you will have a GET form for edit. You will have a post data for edit as well. So two action method. Okay, that also comes for delete. But for delete, we have a small glitch. Okay, so there we are using a little bit different approach. So that we'll discuss later on. Okay, but for create and edit or create and update, we use the same approach, same name, but different verb. HTTP GET, HTTP post. Okay. For create, for edit or update, you can use a post, or if it is a specific put or a patch request, then you can use HTTP put and HTTP patch. Okay. So now, home create, we specify the name, email, and select the department. We click on create. We are redirected to the home details 4. Right? So it is added into the list. Now, so here it's the list for employee. Now, say here I have an empty page, and say if user clicks on the create button, then what will happen? We don't have any validation. So it will create an employee or staff with the ID 5, blank email, and the department none, because that is the first value in the list, in the enum, right? So that should not happen. So you all know, right, which figure is this? So it is the image of national emblem, right? Fine. So now we'll start with model validation. Okay. And right now we are talking about the validation in terms of server side. Later on, the same validations we will use for client side as well. Okay. So here we want that the name and email for fields must be required. User must fill the value for it, as well as the invalid email should not be allowed. Okay, so how to do that? And for validations, again, there are multiple ways. Okay, but we are using the approach of data annotations. Why? Because this data annotation approach is useful for many things, like for server-side validation. The same thing is useful for client-side validation, and the same thing is useful in the entity framework core for making some validations for your tables and databases, and making some configurations for your tables and databases. That's why this data annotations approach is preferable. So here, say on this name property, I'm adding this attribute required or filter required. Sometimes people say it is a attribute, sometimes people say is a filter. required. So first time when you will add, right, you will see a red squiggly line because some namespaces are required to include. So whenever you see this red squiggly line, the best way to include namespaces in a faster manner is to click or press on control dot. If you click, just hover your mouse over the error you are getting, right, and then press control dot. So it will suggest you the different mechanisms through which you can resolve the error. If say some namespaces are missing, it will suggest you, do you want to include them, right, etc. So whenever you get a red squiggly line, green squiggly line, etc., you can just simply press control dot through the keyboard. So it will show the possible solutions. So we are making the name required, email required. Okay, next. Now, say we have made them required, but how to know that actually user is specified or not? That is happening through model binding, and that we can verify through model state. Okay, so that we can verify through model state, whether the state of the model is valid or not. Which model we are talking about? Here, which model you are dealing with? Staff. Right, here you are dealing with staff model. So we are talking about the validation of this model. That means whether all the validations are passed or not. So if any validation is failed, then the model state.isValid property would be set to false. And if all validations are passed, then this property is set to true. And this property model state instance is passed to the controller, not to the action method. Okay, please remember this. Model state is passed to the controller, not to the action method. Why? Because how do you know that which action method will need the staff object? That's why essentially it is passed to the controller. Okay. And if you are interested in knowing this, because this is a very powerful concept, but fortunately we don't have any time in this subject, and it is also part of the next semester subject SOC. It is known as .NET Core filter pipeline. This is a very interesting topic actually. If we have time, definitely we'll include at least one lecture on it, right, at the end. Otherwise, eventually in the web API, we will discuss this. Actually, this topic is the reason, right, for the entire REST API and this .NET Core MVC. These both topics, say in the beginning, we said that the .NET Core, right, so the API and the MVC both are similar. Okay, and the reason is because of this .NET Core filter pipeline. So on the doc itself, on the official website itself, a good tutorial is given. Right? If you find a time, just to read it. Okay, it's very useful. Actually, you will see that how these things are happening. Okay, so here we use this model state to know whether the validations are passed or failed. So if the validations are passed, then we will call the add method, we will add the instance, and then we will redirect the user to the details page. If the validations are failed, then what we will do? We will return the same page. Return view. Which view? Create.cshtml. Right? Now, how to display errors? So here we have included this property, but still which error to display? That we have not mentioned. Okay, and where to mention it? Right now that component we have not included. So for including validations error, right, like we had different validations control in ASP.NET, here we also have them. So here we have tag helpers, ASP Validation Summary and ASP Validation 4. Okay. So here you can see that we have this create.cshtml page, and there, apart from label ASP4 name, input ASP4 name, now we are including a span element, ASP validation 4. That means if there is a validation message for the name property, then it should be displayed here. Similarly, if there is an error for the email, then it should be displayed here using validation tag helper ASP validation 4. And if you want to display summary, then here we have ASP validation summary 4, and that is for all, right? So there are different options for it actually. I think one option is model, another option is all, and third option is none, right? So let's not worry about it right now. Okay, ultimately when we'll discuss the client-side validations, we'll discuss it. Okay, so right now we'll specify all validations for all errors, whether it is related to model or not, doesn't matter. Because sometimes the error can pop up from the action method as well, right? So ASP validation summary for all. Okay, so now you can see that when you click on the create button without specifying anything, it says the name field is required, the email field is required. Then why this specific message? We have not specified this message anywhere. The message is this because here the property name is name, property name is email, and the data annotation attribute or filter is required. That's why the name is required, the email is required. Okay, but if you want to configure this message, okay, then here you can specify the required, then you can specify error message, which message you want to display. So I don't want to display the message the name field is required. So please provide a value for the name field. So this message will be displayed to the user. Okay, and these are the different attributes: required, range, minimum length, maximum length, compare, regular expression. So all those facility which were available in .NET Framework, the same things are available. Okay, so here we are using multiple of them. Required, so the maximum length is 10. Okay, that means the name should not be larger than 10. And then this is the error message. Then say here the email, email is when it is rendered to the user, user will see the label office email. Display it as office email, not as email. So you can see here office email. Okay, so the display name is different than the actual property name. Then which regular expression you want to compare this email with, and then the error message. Okay, if the regular expression is not followed. So here you cannot type more than 10 characters. Here the invalid email format. Okay, now we are adding the validation also for the select. Okay, so here we are adding one option value, please select. Okay, and then this is the validation, ASP validation for department. And then we are adding the required filter on the department property as well. But this department property is of type enum. Please keep this thing in mind. Okay, so now when I click on this create button without specifying any value in the form, the error is the name field is required, the office email field is required, and the value, then empty parenthesis is invalid. It is not saying that the department is required. It is saying that the value is invalid. Why this error? The first two errors are very simple to comprehend, but why this third error? Instead of saying the department is required, why it is saying that the value empty is invalid? Any idea? I'll just keep this form in front of you. Yes, it is enum. So enum is basically it will deal with integral types. And for integrals, here you will see this option value. Right? For integrals, it doesn't mean anything. So that's a problem. Enum cannot deal with the string values. Right? So how can we change it? How can we handle it? Any idea? So basically this DPT is an enum. it will deal with integral values, but here we want to deal with string values. All our options are string, right? Their values are string. So one option is you change the value to numeric, but that's not a good thing. Then what should we do? We should make them nullable. Okay, so here you can see that we are making the DPD nullable because it is dealing with integral. So the same thing we did in the integer parameter in the details one action method, right? Earlier, if you remember, when it was optional in the, say, the routing template, it was optional, right? So when user doesn't specify, and if your action method is integer ID, then you will have exception. So to avoid it, what you did, you made it nullable, integer nullable ID in the action method. Same thing we'll do here. We'll make it nullable. So this DPT is now nullable, right? So now as it is nullable, if you will not select anything, then you will have the error message, the department field is required. And if the sum field in your model class is of integral type, then integral types are by default required. You don't need model validations for it. What I'm saying is that, for example, say you have this public integer ID, and say you are asking user to enter the ID, right? Or you are asking, say, for user to enter phone number, say public integer phone number. Then you don't require to make it required, because integral types are by default required. So when they are not required, you need to make them nullable. Okay. So on integral types, you never need to decorate with required, because by default they are required. So now we have all three errors. Name field is required, email is required, department is required. And now you are seeing that we are not exposing the business logic. And this is very important in API. So at length we will discuss actually. Okay. There will do many things so that the user will see something else than actual code and actual information. Okay. It's not very much important in web application, but this is how you can change it. Okay, so I'm not sure whether you are aware about this website or not. It's the Pratham Books. Okay, so actually many books are available. Okay, but actually thousands of books are available and in many languages. And it is a platform where you can write, or if someone has written a book, you can say translate in some another language. These or are the children books. Right? So what I request is that if you have a hold on some regional languages, and if say some book is available in English, then you can translate into say Gujarati or any other native language, so that it will benefit the kid who are studying in that language. Okay, and it's a free platform. Okay, and if you want to purchase the book, then you can purchase. Otherwise, all the books which are available on these with these organizations, they are available freely readable and freely audible. That means you can listen it. Okay, so when right now the season is not going. This is a slide from the last year. Okay, but if you have some time or if you have passion for it, right, you can translate stories. Okay, and they also have some other events as well, where they will provide support for you. For example, if you want to organize, say, read aloud session in your neighborhood for children's, right? Then they will give you books and some other materials, right, for free of charge, so that you can organize these kind of sessions and everything. So it's a good organizations. Okay. So I'm not asking you to help these organizations. I'm asking you to, or requesting you to read some stories, at least from this website, whenever you have time. Okay. Because the children's stories are, say, very much helpful for any age person. Okay. Okay. Now we'll discuss this thing: add singleton, add scoped, add transient. Can anyone recall where we have used this add singleton? We have used this add singleton somewhere. Okay. DI, yes. Yes, for injecting dependencies, right? In the startup.cs in configure service method, we have used it. Okay. At that time, I told you that we can use different method to inject the dependency: add singleton, add scoped, or add transient. Now, so here we will see the difference between all these three methods. Okay. Most of the time, when we are dealing with, say, non-database situations, we will use add singleton, and when we are dealing with database, we'll use add transient. Okay. So let's start with it. So this is our interface, right? We have three methods right now: get staff, get all staff, and add. This is our mock staff repository, the implementation of our interface with all three methods in the list. This is our controller where we are injecting the dependencies for interface in the constructor. It's the constructor injection, right? And we have discussed this is the correct way of injecting or using the interface or implementation. Instead of saying that underscore staff repository is equal to new staff repository. Okay. And then these are the implementation for or action methods for create and etc. So now here, why I'm showing this? Because yes, we have changed the code. Okay. So here in the staff, create action method of HTTP post. So whenever we create the new staff, we are not redirecting the user. You can see now we are not redirecting the user. We'll again render the same create.cshtml. Right? Whether the model is valid or invalid, right? We will render the same page, create.cshtml. Then now we are changing some code on create.cshtml. We are using this inject because we are injecting dependencies here. So whenever user will make a request to create.cshtml, okay, at how many places the instance of iStaff repository is required. Whenever, say, user is making a request to the URL home/create, then how many instances of iStaff repository are required, right, for rendering this page, create.cshtml? Anyone? One would be in your controller section method. You will need one instance, right? Why? Because here you have this code underscore staff repository. So you need one instance. Okay. Then another instance is needed here when we will use this. So here, say we want to use the instance of iStaff repository. So we need to inject the dependency. Like here in the controller, we injected it in the constructor. So in the view, how you can inject it? Using inject, right? So @inject iStaff repository, I'm saying it staff repo. And then here you can see that I'm using it. So I'm displaying the total staff count, @staff repo.getAllStaff.count. So getAllStaff will return the list of staff. On that I'm applying the count method. So it will count how many staff members are there, and it will display it as a string. So here I'm using one more instance. Okay. Here I'm not sure whether you are clear or not, but you must be clear that whenever with add singleton you are saying in the startup.cs configure services that if someone requests staff iStaff repository, give an instance of mock staff repository. So how many instances are needed for mock staff repository? One instance is needed here in the create action method. This one. Another instance is needed because of this here. So two instances are needed. Okay, so two instances are needed. Now, say ASP.NET Core provides three methods to register services with the dependency injection container: add singleton, transient, and scoped. And which method you use determines the lifetime of the registered service. For how much amount of time that instance is available. Okay. So add singleton method creates a singleton service. A singleton service is created when it is first requested. So when it is first requested in the controller, in our scope, and then the same instance is used by the all subsequent request. So here, if the add singleton is used for registering the services, then here one instance is used for this add method, and the same instance is used for this get all staff method. Okay. So the same instance is used. Add transient. So add transient will create new instance every time. That means, so here, for this statement, it will create one instance in the action method. For view, it will create another instance. Previous case, add singleton, same instance. Add transient, whenever you use this instance of your repository or say your dependency. Here, iStaff repository is your dependency, right? For that, you need to give the monkstaff repository instance. So whenever you are requesting, give the new instance, that is add transient. Okay. And last is add scope. Okay. So add scope, right? It will give a new instance per request within the scope. That means here, say for our this situation, right? It is a request and it's within the same scope. So it will use the same instance, because here, say you are essentially making a request for create. So here action method, it will create one instance, and then this create action method itself is rendering this view create, right? And there again you need an instance of iStaff repository. So the same instance would be served. But if you are making another request, or if your method redirects to some other action method or other controller, then your request changes from home create to say staff create or say student exam, then a new instance gets created. Okay, in add scope, because the scope of a request changes. Okay, so let's stop here. Okay, I'm sure that you must be clear with add singleton, add transient, but still we'll discuss the example that we have, and then it will be clear. Okay, regarding add scope, right, it will be clear only after the example. Till today itself, I'll share this entire presentation with you all, because our next lecture is in the next week, right? So you can go through it, but in the next class, we'll continue with this 3 method discussion. Okay, fine. So thank you for joining me. Still 2 minutes are left. If you have any question, you can ask me. Otherwise, you may take a break before the next lecture starts.